welcome back to ThinkTech Hawaii. We're broadcasting live from downtown Honolulu, Pioneers Plaza, and welcome back to our show Urban Transcendence by Alejandra Yamashita and Martin Despang. Today, me, Martin, being the host. And today, we're actually awaiting a special event that's coming over the weekend, which is Hurricane Anna. So we have our guest today carved out some time because he's actually in part of a team that's in preparation for this major event. So we're lucky to have him here. Today's guest is someone who could be sort of a donor or an advocate for our entire show because he presents the larger scale that we're approaching and hardly ever get to because we bring in people who have a certain expertise in a certain area and hardly get the bigger picture, and that's how we call the show, and that's why. So our today's guest is, once again, many people in one body. He's an architect by training. He's also a scientist, more specifically a neuroscientist. And with that, special greetings to my youngest son, Lenny, who wants to be like you and wants to become a neuroscientist.
Great.
But he's also directing, he's also managing, and he's also planning. And above and beyond all that, he's also heritage preserving.
Great.
So Thomas, thank you very much for being here with us today on the show. And we should say, to be political correct to our employers, that we both work for UH and you specifically for the College of Tropical Agriculture and Human Resources.
That's right.
So we've known each other for quite a while, and I enjoy our conversations like as with few people because we're always all over the place. And whenever I get into nitty-gritties, you pull me out, you're like a mirror for me and say, Martin, there's a bigger picture to that all fits into, and that's why we call the show The Bigger. I was hoping to call it The Bigger Picture, but the humble person you are, you insisted to say it's a bigger picture. So tell us a little bit about your background again. I gave the brief sort of titles, but tell us a little bit where it started and which are the areas you come from and how long you've been here.
Okay. Well, I grew up in New York, and I went to NYU, biology, went to Columbia, biochemistry, worked in a thrombosis research lab and blood clotting, and then moved over to the cardiac cath lab. And then was taking free courses at Columbia, and I was infatuated with architecture, and I changed careers. And I came here, went to school here, worked here as an architect, became a planner, but behind all that, I was interested in how the brain works. I was fascinated that even with science, logical technology, learning about designing such a different process, fascinating, and my thesis was on the cognitive perspective of design. So that's kind of a strange title. I had to pull together professors from cognitive sciences and cognitive psychology on top of architecture. And so in between, I helped out in the International Film Festival, and now as part of members of the State Historic Preservation Board. So that's kind of a I always call myself a professional student because I always have actress interest in cosmology, particle physics, superstring theories, the whole gambit. And so because the way I kind of think in a broad circle, and I thought that it'd be interesting if we look at your title, Transformative Urbanism, in that way. So I'm glad you invited me, and thank you, Jay, for having me be here.
Yeah, and now since you almost invite me and Jay is here, I'm going to do something to you that he taught me to catch your guests off guard, so to speak. So I'm going to ask you the question, thanks to my great mentor, Jay. How are you then able to survive on a daily basis in our isolated environment of Honolulu with all that thinking and knowledge and reflection?
When I first came here, I felt a little isolated. So the trick was then I found out like a book club, a video group. I found societies that had active interest stimulating my curiosities on particular fields. And so that's how I remained stimulated, even though I was a little bit homesick for New York.
So when we prepared for the show, there are two analogies, or I guess precedents that I want your feedback on how you compare Honolulu to them. One of them is Florida, and one of them is Singapore.
Right. I think I think Hawaii is singularly unique in many ways. I think we're at a point, if I can, for example, take my experience from the film festival and present different viewpoints. So, viewpoint from a futurist, and Jim Data will kind of thank me for this, but Hawaii has a chance to be a growth potential, steady growth, or a collapse model. My thinking is Hawaii is going towards the future, the next 40, 50 years. It's steady growth, but a modest growth. So with that in mind, we set the framework of where Hawaii and Honolulu is going. So if we're looking at a pure urban planning model, we start comparing things. So we are at an inflection point because the amount of change that will happen in Kaka'ako and the major investment from Howard Hughes and the decision for Kamehameha schools to start implementing, utilizing the land, OHA and the fourth party, all the small, diverse little owners within the area represents a major change. So given that context, I think we're obligated to look at Singapore, other places where similar climates, like Singapore, other locations where similar, like in Miami, where there's a great migration of retirees to the place, and see how we're different, and see the scope of where we can go. And so with that in mind, I think that we have to understand that carefully as we see the developments approaching, whether they're master planning, the implementations of their thought and designs that are really going to be transformative, going to the title of the show. I think in the next 10 years, they will transform how we will think about the urban environment of Hawaii. And my assumption is that Honolulu will be the basic urban core. I don't see it happening in the Big Island or Maui or Kauai. And so for that mind, we kind of represent like a concentric rings around major cities will be the focal point, and they all contribute to it. So let's look at Singapore. Singapore evolved planned, but recognizing that the mass transit nodes were points for development. And so the perception right now, the opportunity, is recognizing that the hub is coming. Land was relatively cheap right after the economic crash, and the decision to decide what are we going to do. So since the 1970s, after Kaka'ako was basically a landfill reclamation project, and they were trying to figure out what we're going to do besides the industrial park that was there. And because the Fitz and Harding to get financial backing to do any major projects, I think once this project came along, I think there was an excitement to embrace it. But I think I would say this with some caution that when we move in so quickly, so preemptively, that the chance for organic growth or planning and then seeing how the planning and the social interactions occur, and then chance to replant the next project, integrate it with the other projects, may be a little bit abrupt.
So it's on, my analogy is on steroids, right? You grow your muscles too much and you're kind of surprised your shirts don't fit anymore, right? You have to eat more and all that stuff. You're probably, your digestion becomes different.
Right. So I think right now that what's driving it impartially is convenience, in that the timing is right, that the transit node there allows them to connect connection, for example, the Howard Hughes project, using the Apawa to create kind of a central public space leading down toward Alamoana Park. That's a good thing. I think that's a recognition that's important to tie the community together. I think what they're trying to do about a village is that it's appropriate to think that way. What I'm only simply wondering, have they thought further what makes a village? Have they thought in their master planning, setting a foundation, setting some principles, subsequent master plans, whether it's Kamehameha School or others, where how they integrate not only connecting the important part that I learned when I grew up in Manhattan was I didn't know I was living in an island because of all the tall buildings. So the recognition is important. The view corridors between Malka and Mackay, so that if you're standing something, you still remember you're sitting in an island.
Mm-hmm.
But the other important thing for future planning is connecting between the civic core downtown and Waikiki. How does that work? How is that a village? How are you connected from this axis between the other complex we're coming on, and you lay a foundation so that they, when they're setting up their master planning incrementally as they improve, that they all work together. I'm hoping that that seriousness, thinking about what sense of community, the investment in civic excitement and stimulation of what makes the dynamics of people feel engaged, being part of it. And I think it's important because in the next 50 years, what we do now will characterize, define us henceforth in the future. So the question is, do we want to look like Hong Kong, or do we want it to look like Singapore, or Miami, or are we something fundamentally different, recognizing the local culture, the nature of us, and has that thought about in a very serious way? And so those are things on a broad perspective I think is kind of important to think about.
I think what you very politely but also precisely get across is that there is sort of this schizophrenia almost between sort of a local sort of convenience. You use the word convenience, I like that. You know, we do things conveniently and we do them, but they're not really out there somewhere. And now there's recently sort of an awareness that maybe there needs to be more spectacle here. So we bring in recently starchitects, how we call that. So these are star architects, and actually from New York City, it's Richard Meyer, who's going to be one of the next architects by Howard Hughes, and that's the project that you basically refer to. And I'm going to share that. We're currently co-teaching a studio in the architecture school, which we also have to mention. And we work together with Kamehameha Schools, and we charge the students to rethink the way we build vertical living. And you mentioned the Ahupua, that we charge them into saying, what of these principles here and now, because that system is gone, but we live here and now, which could be reinvented, rejuvenated from that kind of system? It's a very, very interesting kind of exploration. And I would say the criticism of the Howard Hughes development of Richard Meyer is that he has always done his white architecture, and you today, very nice shirt, by the way, and it makes sense performatively, right, because it reflects so you don't overheat. Martin isn't appropriately dressed. He still comes from his Nebraska days and I guess thinks about thermal mass and storing them. And so they make accidentally sense because he has always been doing that. But everything else is sort of could be basically in Miami. The palm trees in between could be in Miami as well as here. So where's the cultural appropriateness? And that's just the surface we're talking about. If we go to substance and we really think, and that's something that was striking me, that you're really sort of an advocate for, or a lawyer for a certain social justice, I would call it here, where you said it's basically what's also driving the developments is basically, and that's my word, it's consumerism and capitalism driven, right? So you get money in, and you get people who, you use the nice term, who not necessarily invest, and that means they invest their money, but they might not invest their soul, they might not invest their personality, and that's me playing devil's advocate. So I would like to provoke you and hear your thoughts about that.
Well, I think what I'm really trying to understand is going for the future, 20 years, 50 years from now, we have a model right now. It's important for all cities to take available capital. That's how the systems work. We tried in the 70s when we had master planning and capital didn't come, and no matter whatever good intentions. So we recognize that's going to occur. So at this point in time, what is driving the market? We can say a fair percentage of the current housing demand is a percentage recognizing our history and the people we have here are former families post-World War II, World War I, part of the generation for assimilation, statehood. The subsequent following generations have been living in multi-generational families. We're finally putting a down payment to move out of the multi-family homes. A combination of that and young, middle-class people who are looking to survive, and have decided, perhaps it's not worth commuting from Kapolei or Mililani. And so, and as well as a recognition because of the economics, the global economics, is there's a lot of wealth being generated in China, Hong Kong, and other places, and they're looking for investment dollars. So that's the starting point. And now you look 20 years from now, how will that composition of populations, how would you describe it? It was a recent article that said that Shanghai has to be like 35 million people in order to have the right mix of elderly people, middle class, and working. And so I'm looking at the same projection, next 20 years. How does building things we have here at this point in time lead to a kind of a recognition of the type of composition for a healthy, rich village or cultural society, especially the urban core? What does it tell us about the future generation where, when you grow up, do you make that decision to stay here or to go? And I kind of mentioned to you yesterday, shouldn't our architecture and the way we figure out what the dynamics and how it works represent this kind of, maybe I'm using the wrong phrase, the grittiness of those who decide to stay here or expatriates decide here? Shouldn't a little bit the character of how we live be reflected in the architecture and the urban planning of how we come together as a sense of community?
Great. With that, hold that thought of grittiness. I love it. So we're going to have a little commercial, and we'll be right back with Thomas Lim, The Bigger Picture and Grittiness.
Thank you.
My name is Alice Lee Hagan. I host the ThinkTech Hawaii BizEd Spotlight. We talk about fascinating people and interesting issues that affect our island state here in Hawaii. We broadcast every Thursday from 3 o'clock in the afternoon to 4 and on Olelo 54. Make sure you tune in, and we'll see you soon. Aloha.
So welcome back to Urban Transcendence. Today's guest is Thomas Lim. It's about a bigger picture, and we just, before the break, we had the exciting, provoking term of grittiness, and you were talking about that beyond the buzzwords that developers use, which is basically retail and mixed use and walkable. These are kind of the buzzwords. You're implying that there is something deeper, which is actually the social. I always use wrongly, which I was taught, the term social engineering, as much as I used, basically value engineering as a German. I thought there's nothing wrong with that. Sounds good, but then I learned that Americans kind of hijacked that term. So and again, tell me again in your words that how you started off, how that grittiness, as you say, should actually inform the architecture and the urban fabric.
Well, let's give a historical background, and I'll just take a broad example just for illustration purposes. It's not a perfect model, but I'll start with some. Imagine post-World War II, the housing development goes out in Pearl City, Aiea. Not only are they bound together by that same experience of surviving the internment camps in World War II, but the way they chose to live their lifestyle to communicate to the sense of community, they turned the garages to a second living room, and they are a sense of community. And talking story and the way they interact is a very local style. And so if we think those things are important to give a sense of place, that we architects like to talk about sense of place, if we find those elements that makes Hawaii feel like you're in Hawaii, not only the sense of place of being in the tropical settings, but how people interact, how they affiliate with each other. If you're in Hilo, it's a sense of being bonded to each other, right? Less than 2 degrees of separation, somebody knows something. And so the question is, going forward, as we do these urban developments, how do we protect that sense of interaction, sense of community? When Hillary Clinton talks about village, broad sense, how do we examine what does village means here in Hawaii? I think there's an obligation people who have the capital, the means to think it through, and then allow it to grow organically as things develop. And so that's the type of kind of a deep question, a broader question for not just developments happening here. It'll occur incrementally, sporadically, major projects, but within it, there's a chance to look, how do you want to go for the future? What are we building it for? What type of a lifestyle do we want 20 years? What do we want for our children seeing that lifestyle? And that's the broader question, the bigger question I'm asking.
Great. So you're talking, I mean, the term sense of place also has been used and abused quite a bit as an excuse. It's been used in marketing for what? What do we do? I mean, I've heard it being used for the international marketplace, which for me had a wonderful sense of place. It also had grittiness.
Right.
And it was sort of, it was not authentic in a way of real. It was sort of a projection of an illusion. But it was of a time where, you know, Honolulu sort of invented itself
Right.
in the late 1950s. So then that had patina, basically, and now sort of capitalism comes and scrapes it and builds sort of a generic American shopping mall with high-end Gucci stores in there. And I heard, you know, being used the terminology of sense of place. And our students actually that we're working with right now, they attended the presentation by Howard Hughes about the Richard Meyer, the Gateway Project, and they're mostly local. And they basically echo, or you echo them, because they actually were angry about this. Well, there's El Paina is going, this is where we eat our poke. They like the word warehouse because in relative terms, European cities, China cities, where you're actually originally from, we should also add, right, your ancestry comes from that background. We have 1,000-year-old cities, right? But here, everything is relatively new, so something that's built in 75, which is warehouse, is relatively new, but it has patina and it has locality, it has local culture. It's not corporate. This is where the people go. So they're kind of sad about to see that go, and they're questioning if some of them will have the financial means and capacities to go back in. So I think you kind of hit the spot of some people who usually don't have a voice, but I found it interesting that you call these people actually the people who really influence and impact the local cultures, because these are people who are permanent and they want to invest themselves and they want to participate. So maybe the sort of the means and methods for developing and planning need to be participatory and more inclusive than exclusive. Is that where you're going?
Well, from perspective of historic preservation, there's also recognition that the way I see it is that whatever I preserve in historic preservation, it's not for now, it's not about the past, it's what we allow for the future. Mm-hmm. It's really for the future. Mm-hmm. Okay, from that point of view is, I'm not into position of freezing something for permanence as a museum, because I think things have to be dynamic. Mm-hmm. It has to embrace the future. Mm-hmm. Okay, it has to reach out to modernity. Mm-hmm. I think that's the danger of people who are trapped, trying to find their roots, find their history, not recognizing that, is to accept that going forward, and then how do you embrace the new technology and new point of view? Mm-hmm. The same I would approach with any international marketplace. I had seen previous plans where they had similarly had the idea of Apawa as one of its perceptions. Mm-hmm. So the question is, what are we trying to save? Understand the pulse mm-hmm. of the culture, mm-hmm. okay? Mm-hmm. We don't want to nostalgically retain the 70s and what the perception of what a tourist will look for mm-hmm. in the international mm-hmm. marketplace. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But we are trying to say projection of what we are as a city mm-hmm. and give a good presentation to the visitors mm-hmm. as one aspect. Mm-hmm. And so it's a combination of thinking deeper mm-hmm. than just the iconic quiche that we represent, so that in part, what visitors always look for, a fulfillment, what they think they will see in Hawaii, mm-hmm. so it's part of meeting of that. Mm-hmm. But the question is also provide a level of legitimacy, authenticity mm-hmm. about it, so they actually, I think we're getting to be a much more sophisticated society. Visitors are more sophisticated. When they go to Europe or any place else, they actually want to know about the background. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think future more sophisticated tourists will look for something more authentic mm-hmm. in Hawaii mm-hmm. about the people here, mm-hmm. about our history. And if we can incorporate that and also celebrate the tourists being here, give them a sense of entertainment, I think that's all possible. We can both be enriched by a rich architectural environment that's well crafted, not quite like Disney, but give a presentation of being a good environment, and yet provides all the other things we want, environmental activities, growth. We just have to be very careful how we do it.
It's interesting. I mean, exaggerating that even more as of now, and I think I told on one of the last shows because it really hit me when the German flight attendants from Lufthansa asked me where I'm going, and I said Hawaii. She said great. She said where, and I said wow, and she said oh forget about it. I've just been there my first time. It's
Right.
like LA. Let's forget about
Right.
it. So what actually sort of the boom of the 60s had sort of that glamour has faded away.
Right.
So you're left with an outdated fabric of Waikiki,
Right.
which has basically pretty much become sort of a ghetto almost of an outdated infrastructure, both technologically and socially and touristically, you could say. And then you start a new development from scratch on steroids in Kaka'ako, which is basically sort of a ghetto, one can say. And I'm over-exaggerating here and being the devil's advocate and the provocateur, which ThinkTech Hawaii is proud to be. And one creates another scenario that's basically monofunctional, which is basically condos stacked and stacked and stacked and stacked. So what we're working on in studio is challenging the students to infuse these systems and actually to hybridize and cross-pollinate. That you say, why does that have to be separated? For example, we said there is like bed and breakfast, you know, where you as a family that tries to make a living because they're here and they belong to the serving sort of portion of society, and they rent out a room, and that room becomes the bed and breakfast, and you know the locals or whoever lives here, and they could be you know from wherever, basically share their culture, serve them breakfast. That becomes a talk. And so there's communication, there's a financial benefit to it, and there's a cultural benefit to it. And it could create the marketplace, right, as a scenario that is about communication. I think that's what you're talking about. That's at least what we're talking about in studio with the students.
The way I would see it is it's great to have tourists. It gives us a chance to mingle in a larger kind of a cosmopolitan setting. We get to see people from around the world, and that's a good thing. The only thing I'm asking for is, as we know, the aging population, and we have a population that perhaps may not have the same type of commitment. They're here because they want to retire here, but they're also equally, when things are getting more expensive, to go back to the mainland. And so, understanding the composition here, I think we need to understand what will give us a stable, rich, engaging sense of community, and to think about it carefully. So as your students are thinking about, well, how do I create sense of community that's normally perceived as horizontally? How do you create it on a vertical level? It hasn't been successful. Past experiments, Bauhaus and the early modern movements and the social engineering of the 50s and 60s didn't have enough information, data, in terms of how people interact. We see that in behavioral economics. And so we have to think about it very carefully, how people engage themselves, and think very carefully, if you want social engagement on a vertical level, how to do it. And the whole purpose, again, what is the end game for? What is the vision of how society will work? And so if we think about that, we figure out how the urban fabric will be, and how to make it rich, diverse, interactive, engaging both those people who are only here for 1 month a year, as well as those who are the service sectors, right? And do we find the right, have we figured out, do we seek out and try to figure out what is the right combination, what is the right mix, and so that it's a healthy society. So the people who are very well off are as committed civically as well as cultural activities to make sense of place vigorous, vibrant. And so I think we want everyone to participate, even the people who feel disenfranchised, who are the service workers, because they're working 2 jobs, and they don't have time to go to the opera or the symphony or the next show or the film festival. And so the whole point of having a sense of a cosmopolitan setting is the fact that we have a chance to mingle together, meet each other as people to people, engage. Like you're from Germany, I'm from New York, to have an exchange of ideas and understand you. I think that's the opportunity.
All right. Let's continue that, hold that thought, and let's reconnect to it. We're going to do a little break, and we're going to be back in a second with Thomas Lim and the bigger picture.
Hi, I'm Jay Fidel. That's Liz Shue. We co-host Agritech in the Islands every other Monday, 4 to 5 p.m. here on the ThinkTech series. We love agriculture and aquaculture and of every kind and nature. And we bring in guests who can teach us such fantastic scientific things. What do you think, Liz?
I think it's cool, so we can grow more local food for local people.
All right, come here, 4 to 5 p.m. ThinkTech, Agritech in the Islands, every other Monday. We'll see you then.
See you. Aloha.
So we're back here, Urban Transcendence, Alejandro Yamashita and Martin Despang with Thomas Lim today, The Bigger Picture. And we have only the last third left, and as you guys can already figure, we can talk forever, and I promised I'm going to talk you into getting you back, but at least to cover the basics here about the essence we talk about, I want to provide food for thought that our new dean, Daniel Friedman, has recently gotten himself excited about and shared with us. It's the term tropical ag, and then he added tropical arc. So can you talk a little bit about the sort of the oscillation and the reciprocity between sort of the nature and the built environment, Thomas?
I think the architectural community, as well as other people interested in urban planning, is always seeking something to galvanize, to give a sense of identity. Architecture like to call it vernacular, sense of familiarity of where we live or the things we see, the place where civic engagement, where we meet together. There's something familiar of being in an auditorium or a place like that. And so I think recognizing that when we have Osipov, who is a famous architect who is into lots of important buildings, restaurants, and community settings, we recognize, we remember that's where we had the nice party. That's where we had the big get-together of grandma and pop. And so that becomes part of our framing of what we think about architecture. But we also have an opportunity to let it grow with new technologies. And so we have an opportunity to think about there's aggressive understanding that sustainability is important, that we have to keep a low carbon footprint. And so we have to examine carefully what we mean by passive cooling. We have to recognize what passive indoor, outdoor, in the context of climate change, where historical norms, historical understandings of trade winds and normalities of temperature, comfort range may change. And so we have to account for that, built in new technologies that will consider when it's stagnant and easterly wind. So you may have winds, but they're warm. They may have fog. And so we have to think about air quality as well as comfort range. And so we have to have a capacity to build within that, to have a sense of indoor, outdoor, and yet also accommodate in the future when patterns will change. Don't rely on historical stuff, but that will embrace whatever comes in the future, recognize it occur, and built into our designs, modern ways, new ways, reconceptualize how we can cool, how we clean the air, and so forth.
I think we cannot say what it is, but what you guys see as the background picture is an example for such a thought process and a possible manifestation of the principles we're talking about that we worked on together. So it's interesting, and this is provocative from your side, because you know how hard it is for me to reconnect the students to the basic principles, which I call the pre-fossil principles, and sort of make them become the next generation of Osipov, of Alfred Price, of Pete Wimberly, to reconnect to this sort of joyful embracing of working with the natural elements. So that's kind of lost, right? There were generations kind of missing, and so they're the first generation that could be the sort of the nephews of that generation. But then you say, well, that's not enough. They got to rethink, because this is the beginning of the 21st century. We had the, what was it called, Julio and the other hurricane, and now we have Ana coming. So they're coming one after another.
Isa, yes.
So we can start to debate and question, is that a coincidence or is it an accident or whatever, but it's happening, and for sure should, sort of the very least, to make us think about it.
Right.
So when you sort of in your announcement, we basically, the final two words is basically your interests and expertise and experience within CTAR is basically climate change and food security.
Right.
So how do they overlap, and so what does one actually have to do with the other one? It's very important for our show where we talk about transcending the urban, but then you actually have the hinterland, that's a borrowed German term, which is the land that's basically available. You call it here, keep the country country. So what's your opinion about that? Which I always know they're very provocative and make me think outside of my comfort zone.
And so what I try to caution people when we use models of Miami, of Singapore, and things like that, is that as they build out their structures, their cities and so forth, and their planning, is that they don't have the same constraints that Hawaii has because we're isolated. They will always be close to the landmass where you get agriculture. And so in some place there's an asymptote, there's a plateau by which land for development, because we need, there's a recognition to preserve land for conservation as well as for agricultural support. The trick is to figure out what level by which we're comfortable in terms of food consumption, our choices, our cultural preferences in combination, and that provides not only subsistence but a rich, what I call fair exchange of imports and exports. So we can find products we export, so we can import the strawberries and things that we doesn't grow well here, because if we believe for nutritional balance and flavors and taste that we all enjoy, then I think that's a consideration. And the same thing, we have to think about the building materials. We know that 42% of our energy consumption is either in the maintaining of buildings or the construction of buildings. Okay, and so the energy footprints of construction, if we can bend the curve there, we can ultimately protect ourselves in terms of whatever constraints of energy costs in the future, whether we ever get to fusion or other natural gases. I think it will insulate us, but we will always have to be conscious and aware of that, A, because for the environment, or sea rise, if you're politically correct, you want to talk about just the sea rise. But there is climate change, and we have to think about it. And food security, because where we're located, it will not change. It's a fundamental. If you live in Hawaii, something that will never change. The politics may change, the players may change, the architecture may change, but concerns of where we get our food will never go away. And so that's why it's one of the grand challenges.
Yeah, and our concerns are that currently, since we talk about numbers, they come to 90-95% from overseas, and they're going to be shipped in with containers.
So it's about 80%.
So we
80
don't
to
have
85% around here.
Okay, so we don't have security, right? We have insecurity. If Aina outside, she is coming, right?
Yes.
She hits us hard. We're going to have 3 days, right? 3 to 4 days.
Yes.
And to my knowledge, the major food supplies are in the hotels. So you can see this kind of movie. You come from the movies as well. You know, you can see a movie coming out of it where the people are basically invading the hotels and then get it out there. You know, and there's fight for food, right?
Right.
So do you see that? You see that separation of the city as sort of a hard environment, and the soft of the agricultural surrounding around it, or you see some kind of fusion?
Right. So what's important is it sets an overall balance, because if there's a recognition for food security, we need to preserve a certain amount of land for agriculture to produce food. Ultimately, there's going to be a limit in terms of water use, as well as land, to how much urban growth there can be, or housing growth. And so that's where the balance comes in. So recognizing if a certain amount of land is for conservation, a certain amount of land is for necessary agriculture, and therefore housing then will either have to be urbanized or going vertical, which is what we're recognizing now. And we have to make the decisions, what is the balance? And then if we go vertical, how do we retain a certain quality in terms of cultural quality or integrity that a life that we want to stay here, we choose to make, and let's talk about the grittiness. And so it's that determination to figure out what that is, and then we can build, urban planning-wise, the texture and the flavor of the architecture that will represent the people who want to live there in this particular context.
hits a favorite term of Alejandri and you and me, which is called architecture as opposed to architecture.
Yes.
So there's a certain pattern performatively that make nature work the way it works, and we're constantly researching together how architecture could sort of mimic that. We're afraid of the term biomimicry because it sometimes just
Sure.
tries to mimic on the surface, but we try to sort of learn substantially. There's one term I want to provoke you with, which you had provided me, that is stubbornness. Can you elaborate on stubbornness and how you think that's important for the future of our islands?
I would say a determination to find solutions, for example, bringing urban agriculture into your homes, into your apartments, finding ways to conserve and yet create new energies. And so looking for opportunities is that aggressiveness to find a solution. That stubbornness is our resilience to find ways to build a new fabric which incorporates understanding of conserving energy, creating new renewable energy, recognizing what foods we should eat more properly to keep us healthy, understanding that and learning to cook better and more naturally, as well as giving the availability to also provide enough food that will help the larger population, the rest of the world. We're in a global community, so we can't forget that too. And so to recognizing all the little parts and pieces that if you're in an urban environment, you're still related to what we grow out in central Oahu. So we're all connected. And to recognize that and to build an infrastructure that relates to all of that, so there's a certain harmony, there's a certain balance on all that. So I think I find that a fascinating thought to figure out how that will work.
Yeah, which, by the way, Hawaiian culture, to my knowledge, had a word for, which is pono. Pono means imbalance of the elements and the ingredients. So the all-encompassing awareness of things without reducing them down, or I would say institutionalizing them. We're both working for institutions, but try to break free at times, and that's where we work together. And not to be technocratic about these terms. I think that's what I love, always loved, and will always love to work together, is that you have the bigger picture, and the bigger picture allows poetry as a major means that is sort of, you know, the umbrella, and sort of embracing all these components, and that it's highly sort of due to your neuroscience background, right? That you're able to have the different synapses and they all bring it together and they work simultaneously, as opposed to we're so tempted, and because it's convenient to reduce things to little slices and ignore stepping outside and looking at them from other perspectives.
And so when we talk about the bigger picture, I'll step in my little shoes and interest about neuroscience and say we all live in kind of a soft cone of awareness. So not only because we're such visual persons, what we see, we feel like we're living the reality here, our perception of it. What we forget, and sometimes we're intellectually aware behind us, above us, something we don't see, but we don't feel that. We feel like I'm engaged with the world in general. But the reality is that our brains reconceptualize things to fill in. We're in inference machines, we fill in the gaps, and we reconstruct. And so whatever's in our attention, we care about. For example, ironically, even though we're looking in this view, soft cone, we have a blind spot. So we infer from that too. Not only do we infer the world that's behind us and above us that we don't see, there's a part of us, there's a blind spot in front of us that we fill in. So we have to recognize our so-called cognitive biases. And one of our cognitive biases, if we're not engaged in something, it's hard for us to understand to think about the future, hard to think about planning, because it's not part of our attention span at the time. And so I think it's important, not only because as we think, as I see here, I'm engaging and using my memory to fill in what lights are, what tables are, because I'm not actually thinking about details, but I'm using the resources of my memory. It's like history. So we use our history to help build the tools by which we live our world, and we have to be consciously aware where our future is going towards so we can build towards it. And so we have to recognize how we think, how we see about the world, recognize that, and recognize our shortcomings of what we pay attention to, and that's what I'm really is about. How do you get the big picture is how to make sure what are you recognizing, what's the attention you give it to, and how you give value to things that are still important, and yet it's around you, you don't see it's behind you, but you know what, you're still part of that world. There's still a larger universe that you're living in, even though you don't perceive it. But you believe you're living it, but there's still a part that's not there, and you have to be prepared for it, as in climate change and everything else.
Thank you, Thomas, for this. This was Thomas at its best, as he is actually every day. This was a fabulous, eruptive conclusion of the show. We're running out of time. It was a pleasure to have you. I wanted to ask you one last question, which I'm running out of time, so I'm just saying it, and I'm explaining in the next show. Thank you for being a wonderful, exemplary representation of the species of exotics. So thank you very much, Thomas. A pleasure to have you. Thank you guys for having been on the show, and see you next week. Bye-bye.